I knew exactly what was expected of me, and that was precisely what suffocated me. The pastor's daughter, the girl in the front pew, the young woman who didn't falter even when closing her eyes to pray. My name was Tamsin Blake, but it felt like everyone had renamed me from the day I learned to walk through the church corridors with my hands clasped and my eyes lowered. I grew up hearing that the heart was deceitful, that desires were traps, and that the world outside offered nothing but perdition. And for a long time, I believed it. I believed fiercely, with fear, with guilt. I did everything right. I wore modest clothes, memorized verses, served on Sunday afternoons, smiled sweetly even when I wanted to scream. But there was something, a flicker, a murmur, an almost imperceptible crack growing inside me even as I tried to ignore it. It was as if something was calling me from beyond the gate, something I couldn't name but that made me tremble inside. It wasn't rebellion or disdain for faith. It was a thirst for truth, for breathing, for feeling something that was mine. And it was at this point, in this thread of restlessness silently pulling at me, that he appeared. No one truly knew him. He was new in town, with hands marked by work and a way of looking that saw beyond appearances. He didn't speak loudly or impose himself, but there was something about him that left me unsteady, not because of his looks, but because of his lack of judgment. It was the first time someone looked at me as if I weren't an extension of my father, the Bible, or my family's reputation. And that alone was enough to make something in me quake. There were no words exchanged at first, just presence. But it was enough to ignite a fire inside me I didn't know existed. Suddenly, everything I did began to feel mechanical. The prayers, the smiles, the hymns, all rehearsed, all empty. And that emptiness only became clearer when I remembered the way he averted his eyes from mine, as if he knew exactly the weight that contact carried. I didn't want to fall. But the truth is, I was already falling long before I realized it. And the fall wasn't his. It was mine, silent, solitary, and utterly inevitable. The first times I saw him weren't marked by words, but by something subtler, a kind of shared silence, a recognition that happened in the space between glances and gestures. He worked at the old mechanic shop next to the market, and everyone said he was too quiet to be trustworthy. He didn't attend church, didn't join town events, and no one knew exactly where he'd come from. That was enough for them to condemn him based on what he didn't say, but that was exactly what drew me in. His lack of explanations, his freedom to not need to fit in. Meanwhile, I was increasingly trapped. Every church meeting felt like a choreographed performance, where I was always the first to be watched. The pastor's daughter, they said, as if pointing to a cross, not a title. My father was loved by many, feared by some, respected by all, and he never hesitated to use my image as living proof of his righteousness. I was the reflection of what he preached, and therefore I didn't belong to myself. My steps were monitored, my clothes commented on, my smiles deciphered, and yet I began to detour on Wednesday mornings to pass by the shop, not by strategy, but by impulse. It was as if my body started acting on its own, responding to something my mind still fought to suppress. I pretended to look at the flowers in the corner store's window, but my gaze always sought him, the man with grease-stained hands and the clearest eyes of any sermon I'd ever heard. And each time our eyes met, it was as if a crack opened in the armor I'd worn my whole life. The strangest part was that he never tried to approach me. He never called out, never spoke to me. It was my curiosity that grew, my desire that seeped through the edges of composure. At home, I began to stay silent for long stretches, just listening to the sound of my own restlessness. In prayer, I no longer asked for protection. I asked for clarity. I asked for permission. And when I realized that permission wouldn't come from heaven, I understood it might have to come from me. For the first time, I started writing letters I didn't send, letters to myself, words that told the story of a Tamsin no one knew, not my father, not the congregation, not even myself entirely. But he seemed to recognize that hidden version of me. And that scared me more than any hell, being truly seen. That Friday night, while everyone gathered in the church hall for the communal supper, I stayed in my room, claiming a headache no one questioned, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of convenience. I sat on the edge of the bed in my still-ironed dress, my thoughts completely unraveled. The open window let in the warm, late summer breeze, and outside, the world seemed to keep turning as if nothing in me was about to break. But I knew something was coming undone inside, like an old wall starting to crack at the edges before collapsing entirely. The morning before, he had greeted me for the first time, not with words, but with an almost imperceptible gesture, a slight nod, his eyes lingering on mine longer than usual. That was enough to change how I existed for the rest of the day. Everything that came after that look, the Bible reading, the choir rehearsal, even the prayer before meals, lost its texture. I did it all, but I wasn't present. It was as if a second Tamsin walked beside me, whispering that there was an entire world beyond the frame I'd been placed in. And in that moment, sitting in the dark room, I understood that what held me wasn't faith. It was fear. Fear of being called ungrateful, of disappointing my father, of becoming a subject of prayer and gossip. But more than that, fear of losing everything I knew without being sure what I'd find on the other side. Still, deep down, I had already crossed that border, not with my feet, but with my heart, because the guilt I'd been taught to carry no longer weighed as heavily. I felt desire, not just for the man, but for a life where I could choose what to love, how to live, who to trust. For the first time, the prayer that escaped my lips wasn't memorized. Lord, if I'm wrong, silence me. But if this is what it means to truly live, don't let me turn back. The next morning I rose earlier than usual, put on a simple dress, and walked to the shop as if walking into myself. My heart beat too loudly, and the world seemed quieter than ever. He was there, bent over an engine, not seeing me. But I saw him. And in that moment, without him touching me, I felt the impact of everything that choice would mean, because I knew this was the beginning of the end, or perhaps finally, the start of everything. The feeling of crossing the shop's gate. That morning was like stepping barefoot outside the walls of a fortress that had protected me my whole life, and also kept me captive. I knew what I was doing. I knew the name of the risk, the taste of future shame, the judgment that would come before any explanation. But in that moment, none of it paralyzed me. There was a kind of courage in me that didn't shout. It just took a deep breath and stepped forward. He looked up as soon as he noticed my presence, and it was as if all the noise of the tools, the heat of the oil, the smell of iron, vanished. The world hung suspended between our eyes. There was no question, no invitation, just a silent understanding. I was there because I wanted to be, not because he had called me, and perhaps that's why he didn't smile or approach. He just wiped his hands on a dirty rag and waited. I didn't say anything either. I stood there for long minutes, watching his hands, his broad shoulders, his serious face. And it was only when he offered me a chair with a brief gesture that the air began to flow between us again. Sitting in that small space, amid the smell of grease and old paint, I felt something I'd never felt in church: peace. Not the rehearsed peace of right words and promises of salvation. It was something else. A raw, shapeless peace that came from the simple fact of being myself there, unfiltered, without applause, without a role. I returned other times, always alone, always with my heart racing. We spoke little, almost nothing. But there was something in his presence that calmed and awakened me at the same time. I talked more about myself than I ever had with anyone. I shared small stories, forgotten dreams, confessions that had never come out in prayer. He listened without interrupting, and I began to realize he wasn't the kind of man who needed to prove anything. That, in itself, disarmed me. Little by little, I started missing rehearsals, arriving late to services, deflecting when my father asked where I'd been. The first sign that something was being noticed came in the form of a look. My aunt, Eva, vigilant, watched me as if sniffing out sin. Then came the whispers, the veiled messages, the sudden concern for my spiritual path. And finally, there was him, my father, with the Bible open on the table and his brow furrowed like a sentence, about to be read. But even then, with fear growing inside me like a fire under my skin, I hadn't backed down. Because what was beginning to grow between me and that man wasn't an impulsive passion. It was something that made me whole. And deep down, I already knew no one would approve. But if I gave up now, I wouldn't just be losing him, I'd be losing myself. The tension hanging over my house was like an overcast sky that never poured rain, but never let the sun in either. My father didn't speak directly, but everything about him screamed. His sermons grew heavier, filled with veiled warnings about temptation, crooked paths, and the youth who stray from the fear of the Lord. My mother, always silent, began folding clothes with more force, as if trying to stitch into the fabric what she couldn't say with words. Overnight, I had become the family's exposed wound, the one everyone knew hurt, but no one dared touch. And the most painful part was knowing this didn't come from a concrete mistake. I hadn't run away, hadn't given myself over, hadn't done anything beyond looking at someone with truth. But for them, that was enough. Desiring was enough to be guilty. Choosing was enough to be a sinner. The town, with its invisible walls of morality, began to close in on me. The women who once greeted me with kisses on the cheek now averted their eyes. Some young people I grew up with started whispering as I passed, and invitations to the study group meetings simply stopped coming. There was no fight, no direct confrontation. What they did was worse. They silenced me with indifference. I kept going to the shop, but now I did so later when the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the streets were less crowded. There was a secretive air that gave me chills and strength at the same time. He never pressured me, never tried to take a step beyond what I offered. But there was something in his presence that pulled me deeper. One night I sat on the shop floor among scattered parts and cried, not out of guilt, but because I realized my world, built on the image of the ideal daughter, was crumbling. He just sat beside me, without touching me, and stayed there. In that moment I understood what I felt. I loved him, not because he was different, but because with him I was. And it was that love, silent, without promises, without a visible future, that lit the fuse of my fall. Days later, during a Sunday service, my father called me to the pulpit. He didn't warn me, didn't prepare me. He just called me with that tone of authority that allowed no refusal. In front of the congregation, he looked into my eyes and spoke about the importance of purity, obedience, and vigilance. He asked rhetorical questions. Are you still worthy of the position you hold in this church? It was like a trial disguised as public exhortation. I froze. My hands sweated, my stomach churned. And yet, I stood there, silent. But inside, something broke. I knew in that exact moment there was no going back. Whatever I did from then on wouldn't be accepted, forgiven, or understood. And with that, a part of me was also freed. Because if I was already guilty, then at least let it be for something worth it. And he, that man with worn hands and eyes that didn't judge me, was worth it. Not because he was perfect, but because he saw me, and I was tired of living invisible under spotlights. That night, I didn't go home. I walked the town streets with calm steps, as if each corner, each lamppost was a silent goodbye to the life I was leaving behind. I didn't cry, I didn't run, I didn't say farewell, because there was no room for explanations where the decision had already been born. I carried only a small bag with some hastily folded clothes and my notebook, where I'd written all the thoughts I was never allowed to voice. I went to the shop where he had already locked up. I knocked firmly and without fear, and when he opened the door, I didn't need to say anything. The look we exchanged carried everything. He hesitated for a moment as if wanting to protect me from myself, but then he just stepped aside to let me in. I slept on an improvised mattress with a thin blanket and a head full of overlapping images. My father's stern eyes at the pulpit, the congregation's silent judgment, and his face, calm, tired, but full of truth. The days that followed were harsh. The town split between those who pretended I never existed and those who used me as an example of moral ruin. My mother didn't look for me. My father didn't say a word. The church moved on, and within a few Sundays, another young woman took my place at the piano. But I started working with my hands. I cleaned, swept, wrote letters to agencies, looked for other places to live. For the first time, my life was no longer dictated by calendars and verses. I washed my own dishes, earned small change, read books borrowed from an elderly woman who welcomed me with tea and silence. He helped without intruding. He stayed there, present, without demands. We slept in separate rooms, and yet the intimacy between us grew like a strong tree that doesn't need to bloom in plain sight to be real. At some point, a letter arrived with my father's handwriting. A single sheet folded in 3 with one sentence. "Daughter, if this is your path, may the Lord have mercy." There was no longing, no invitation, just condemnation disguised as prayer. I burned the letter in the dirt yard, and the ashes flew high like everything I was leaving behind. I didn't hate my father. I didn't hate anyone. But it no longer hurt to be rejected by those who never saw the woman behind the perfect daughter. And then, on a warm autumn afternoon, while he fixed an old bicycle and I washed paintbrushes with hands stained with color, he looked at me and said simply, "You're here, but you still seem far away." I looked at him and answered, not with words, but with a kiss. A calm, mature, conscious kiss. The first thing done without fear in a long time. And in that gesture, I understood that my escape wasn't a mistake. It was a return, not to him, but to myself. The months that followed brought a calm that at first made me wary. It was strange to wake up without having to prove anything to anyone. Strange, but liberating. The absence of the weight of perfection made me lighter, simpler, more alive. We shared an uncomplicated routine. Coffee brewed fresh, hands stained, with work, comfortable silence between tasks. The love between us wasn't rushed or impulsive. It was constant. It didn't need to assert itself every moment because it was there, firmly rooted in everything we did together, from fixing a window to the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't watching. There were days when the memory of what I left behind still haunted me. I dreamed of the packed church, my father's face hardened by judgment, the hymns sung without my voice in the choir. But upon waking, I'd look at that simple ceiling, smell the paint, hear the slow sound of life unfolding, and I'd anchor myself in the present again. I started writing more often, not just scattered thoughts, but fictional letters to the Tamsin I used to be. I told her what I'd discovered, how the world was bigger than the church's fence, how guilt can be mistaken for obedience, and how true love doesn't have a thunderous voice, but the presence of a root. One day, walking through a neighboring town, I bumped into a girl from the church. She pretended not to see me, but her eyes carried a mix of scandal and curiosity. And for the first time, that didn't hurt. I just smiled inside, because I knew what she saw was only the surface. No one there knew the strength it took to rebuild, from zero, to live without the shield of others' expectations, to love someone not for what they offer, but for who they are when no one's watching. And I, at last, loved like that. It was on one of those mornings that he brought me a ring. Simple, crafted metal, no flashy shine. He placed it on the table and said only, "This isn't about church or names or approval. It's about wanting to share the path with you." I looked at the ring, then at him, and realized no ceremony in the world could validate what we already knew. I accepted without hesitation, and in that moment the pastor's daughter I once was vanished for good. In her place was a woman who chose, and was chosen, outside altars, outside spotlights, but at the exact center of truth. The simplicity of the life we built together never felt small. On the contrary, it was grand in what truly mattered. We had little but enough. We lived in a modest house on the edge of town, surrounded by trees and silence, and every corner of that place carried a piece of us. The walls were painted with our conversations, the floor creaked with our rhythmic steps, and the air held the warm scent of a routine that was ours alone. He worked at the shop during the day, now busier, and I, besides helping, started selling small handmade crafts and notebooks stitched with excerpts of my texts. The words that were once my refuge now became my bridge to the world. It was through those words that my mother found me. I received a letter in her hesitant handwriting saying she'd read one of my texts sent by a church lady. She didn't mention regret or forgiveness. She just said, "You seem well, more alive than ever." I read that sentence so many times I nearly memorized it, and even without an explicit invitation, I felt it was time to return, not to reconnect with the old version of me, but to face, as the woman I'd become, the past left unresolved. When I returned to the town, it seemed smaller than I remembered. The streets felt narrower, the looks less sharp. Some still avoided me, others just watched with a kind of silent respect, as if they understood, even if they didn't agree, that I had done something they never had the courage to do: choose my own voice. My parents' house was the same, but my mother, aged, hugged me with a tightness that said more than any sermon ever had. My father didn't come down to see me that day, and that was okay, because I hadn't gone there to convince him of anything. I went to recognize myself in the walls where I grew up, and realized that what was left behind didn't need to be carried with me forever. On the way out, I met him on the sidewalk, the man I chose, the one everyone turned their noses at, but who was the only one who never asked me to be less than I am. He was waiting, leaning against the old truck, his eyes full of calm. And when I approached, he just extended his hand. I took it. In front of the town that condemned us, without fanfare or ceremony, we walked together down the main street, not as fugitives, but as those who returned from an internal exile and chose, at last, to be free. The last summer I spent in that town wasn't marked by scandals or ruptures. It was silent, as if time had finally learned to respect the space I fought to claim. He and I continued our lives outside the invisible walls that once tried to trap us. We weren't a defiance. We didn't want to be a symbol of anything. We were just alive, together, and whole, which for me was miracle enough. The days became slower and sweeter, as if haste was no longer necessary. There was peace in the small rituals, the smell of bread baking in the late afternoon, the sheets swaying on the clothesline, the books scattered around the living room. It was an ordinary life, and for that very reason, sacred. I returned to writing more deeply and published my first book with a small local press. It was a collection of memories and reflections on faith, guilt, freedom, and love, without names, without accusations, but those who knew me understood. Some copies reached the church. I don't know if my father read it. He never wrote to me. But in one copy, found anonymously in the town library, there was a marked sentence. Sometimes, following your own truth is the most sacred act we can offer God. I kept that not as an answer, but as a seed. Because not all forgiveness comes in words. Sometimes silence is the hardest and truest gesture someone can give. In time, the town forgot us. New scandals arose. Other stories filled the church pews, and I stopped being the whisper in the corridors. It was as if they finally understood that denying me was pointless. I was there, alive, loving, writing, living. One autumn morning, I received a letter from an unknown young woman. She said she was a pastor's daughter from another town, and my story had helped her not lose herself. She didn't ask for advice. She just thanked me. I kept that letter between the pages of my favorite notebook like a small blessing. Today, as I write these final words, I'm sitting in the same yard where I planted my first lavender pot. He's there across the porch, reading the newspaper and drinking the coffee I just made. When he looks at me, I still see the same man who saw the woman hidden inside the perfect girl. The pastor's daughter no longer exists, and I don't mourn her. Because between losing the world's approval and finding my own soul, I chose what no one dared approve. Love, for him, for myself, and for the truth that set me free. Years have passed since I left the altar where they placed me, without asking if I wanted to be there. And if there's anything in me that remains, it's not the title of pastor's daughter or the image of the exemplary girl everyone tried to preserve. It's the woman born from the hard choice not to betray her own soul. Sometimes people ask if I regret it, if I'd go back, do things differently. And I smile, always gently, because those who ask don't understand that my regret would have been staying silent, invisible, trapped in a role that was never fully mine. I was afraid, yes. I cried alone more times than I can count. But never, not for a second, did I wish to return to the life where everything was appearance and obedience. Today, my hair is gray and my voice is firmer than ever. I walk through the town with calm steps, and few recognize me. Some look at me as if trying to pull a forgotten scandal from the past, but it no longer bothers me, because I no longer exist for them. I exist for me, for the Tamsin who believed in her own fire, even when everything around her clamored for water. I still write, still plant flowers. I still love him. He's aged by my side, with the same serenity with which he waited for me. He never demanded anything, just stayed. And that, more than any proof of love, taught me what it means to be free beside someone. Every now and then, a young woman seeks me out. They come discreetly with eyes full of questions they're not yet brave enough to ask aloud. They sit near me, approach the subject indirectly, and wait for my reaction. And I don't give them sermons. I give silence, listening, and, if they ask, a story. Because every woman must find her own way out, her own path out of the cage. Mine was love. Not the kind everyone dreams of seeing at the altar, but the kind that blooms where it's least expected, between fear and courage, between the fall and the choice. If my story is ever told, I hope they say less about the scandal and more about the salvation. Not the one promised with dogmas, but the one I found when I could look myself in the eyes and say, I won't hide anymore. And if any doubt remains, let it be recorded here in the final lines of this life's diary. It wasn't rebellion. It was love. And love, when it's true, doesn't need approval, just courage to be lived.